Justin Ford for From the Frontline. In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. In tonight's episode, we will be discussing how governments use pervasive propaganda to change perceptions and people. Dr. Hammond, you claim that governments use pervasive propaganda to change perceptions and people. Can you give some examples of how this is done?
Yes, we've just had a very enlightening example here in South Africa, fake news 24/7. That's what we call News 24. I mean, they are nothing but fake news 24/7. They've recently been exposed yet again as a propaganda mouthpiece for the ANC, which is the government in South Africa. Rapport, which is the largest Afrikaans newspaper in South Africa, did an expose of showing real investigative journalism, disclosing that News 24's recent Not in My Name letter from so-called prominent Afrikaners was actually produced by Cyril Ramaphosa, a senior director of DIRCO. That's the Directorate of International Relationships and Cooperation, which is what the ANC calls the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. DIRCO, it's somehow or another not enough to have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They've got to change the name and so on. Just like teachers are now enablers and students and pupils are now called learners, and they just want to change everything around. It's just typical nonsense. Well, the moment that this Not My Name letter came out, which is basically about 40-odd so-called Afrikaans people, although they, on record, most of them, like Max de Pre, are saying, I'm not an Afrikaner and I hate Afrikaans and I'm embarrassed that I've got any Afrikaans ancestry. And so these are people who dissociate themselves from being Afrikaans, but on this occasion, they claim to speak on behalf of the Afrikaners. And so Not in My Name is a rebuke to Donald Trump for daring to speak up for Afrikaners, because Afrikaners are not being persecuted and there's no racism in South Africa, even though there's 144 race-based legislations in this country. And Afrikaners are not being persecuted, even though thousands have been murdered and tortured to death by these farm-invading scum. And even though government leaders and members of parliament have been dancing around singing "Kill the Boer, kill the farmer," and our courts have said it's not hate speech to sing about killing people of another race and all this. And so this Not in My Name letter is basically claiming that the Afrikaans people are the previous oppressors. They're not victims, and they're not being targeted, and there's no racial discrimination in South Africa and so on. They acknowledge that there's problems, but, basically the ANC are the victims and everything here is complicated and they don't want to take responsibility for anything. Funny that they don't want to be Afrikaners, but they claim to speak on behalf of the Afrikaners. Well, the instant this letter came out from News 24, the EFF Rebel rouser Julius Malema and the ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa quickly praised this letter, even at the same time that some of the people who were listed as signatories were saying, I don't know how my name got in there, I want to take it off, I'm not associating with this letter. So it has come out through Rapport, who did real investigative journalism, that the letter started with a woman called Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the senior director of DIRCO, the ANC's Foreign Affairs, and she had been based in Washington, D.C. right until December last year. So she produces this letter, which is obviously a government PsyOp, or psychological operation propaganda campaign. And we're not even sure where the letter came from. Everyone's saying they're doing a search on the internet. They can't find the letter anywhere. The letter seems to have originated with News 24. So it's not that they put out the letter and then News 24 responded. It looks like News 24 got this letter directly from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, i.e. the Foreign Affairs, and they made it a news item. And so, this is fake news 24/7 hitting again. What a propaganda campaign. The government puts out a letter. The government praises the letter, uses it all over the world, and News 24 is left exposed now as just a mouthpiece for the ANC's propaganda operation. So here you've got the government not making news, but the government creating the news reporting even. And then just to follow this on as another example of the other side of the coin, Solidarity exposed the hypocrisy of our government and the intolerance of our government and the censorship of this government, the ANC, by paying for an advertising banner in Johannesburg close to the international airport, designed and timed for the arrival of the G20 participants, which is now more like G16 because so many of the top G20 countries aren't being represented, including America and Russia. But they had a big banner declaring, "Welcome to the most race-regulated country in the world." Now, this is true. It's a fact. 144 race laws. Now, considering that under apartheid we had close to 40 race regulation laws, here we've got 140 odd, and considering that they condemned the National Party government for apartheid race laws, well, we've got much more and much more intrusive laws and ruinous ones now, and this is the most race-regulated country in the world. Solidarity is quite right. They paid for this advert. Well, the municipality of Johannesburg ripped down the paid advert, which I think violates our freedom of speech guarantees in the Constitution. Well, Solidarity has decided to put up multiple more banners and billboards around Johannesburg saying the same thing: welcome to the most race-regulated country in the world. And I think the government taking it down has given it more coverage. More people are going to see the image than would have if they just left it alone and ignored it. So plainly what we see is the government is creating propaganda and getting media lapdogs of theirs like News 24, Fake News 24/7, to just launch these things and pretend it's an independent, spontaneous operation. And then they're willing to censor not just free speech, but even paid for advertising. Therefore, I think that's just a classic example of governments getting involved in propaganda to change your perception and to change people.
How are we to understand propaganda, Dr. Hammond?
Well, just think of the narratives and images of war in Ukraine. We got bombarded with it. Now, it's a well-known statement: the first casualty in war is truth. And you can say that for the Ukraine war as much as for anything. The amount of times we were told that Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked. Unprovoked aggression. Well, it's aggression, but you can't call it unprovoked because Zelensky was time and again applying to join NATO. And then we had President Putin of Russia regularly warning that Ukraine cannot be allowed to join NATO. And in fact, NATO has expanded in 5 different waves towards Russia, taking over many, many countries that used to be not just allies of Russia, but even used to be part of the old Russia and the old Soviet Union, and including Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and that right now with countries that even used to be part of Russia, including Finland, if you go back far enough, now joining NATO, the whole situation, you can't call it unprovoked. In fact, we've discovered more than 20-odd American biological warfare laboratories inside Ukraine. And it was just a few months before Russia's military operation going into Ukraine that they asked America to give guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. Ignored. They asked in January 2022 to give assurance that America won't put bases or missiles inside Ukraine. Ignored. In February, just before the attack in 2022, President Putin requested President Biden for an urgent meeting to try and avert the crisis heading up about Ukraine. Biden refused to meet with him. So you can't say it was unprovoked. In fact, if NATO hadn't been talking about admitting Ukraine into NATO, and if the West hadn't been pumping weapons into Ukraine, this crisis may never have occurred. More importantly than that, the war really started in 2014, because it was when the United States government put $6 billion, and this came out earlier this year with the Doge exposés of USAID corruption, that America put billions, $6 billion into creating new media in Ukraine, who fomented a revolution, in fact a coup d'etat that overthrew the elected government in Ukraine and brought about this revolution, which in 2014 banned Russian in Ukraine as a medium of education. And at that point, the eastern Donbass regions seceded from Ukraine because they were 95% Russian-speaking. And why should they want to be in a country that forbids their own language? And you then had Russia going into Ukraine to protect their people, ethnic Russians, who wanted to be part of Russia, who'd had a referendum to break away from Ukraine, and who'd been bombed. Thousands of Ukrainians, Russian-speaking ethnic Russians in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, who were being bombed by Ukrainian military. Airstrikes, artillery strikes, rocket strikes, ground offensives. And so Russia went in to protect Russians who were being slaughtered in Ukraine. You can't call it unprovoked. You can call it aggression, but you can't call it unprovoked aggression. But that was the refrain, like a compound noun. Russia's unprovoked aggression, over and over and over. And you get all kinds of images. And then there was all kinds of pictures of, the Russian tanks being destroyed and the Russian military being defeated and great things being done by Ukraine, and the ghost of Kiev, which is some fictitious pilots flying some plane that didn't exist that was shooting down Russian aircraft, and turned out that some of these things were not just AI, but were video game things. And there was so much fake news, and they came up with all kinds of fake stories of both Russian atrocities and of Ukrainian victories, which turned out to be completely fraud. And anyway, if all these news reports were true, Russia would have been defeated and Ukraine would have been in Moscow already, because it was always, every news report about how great the Ukrainian army was and how much they were doing and all these terrible defeats of the Russians. Well, if any of that was true, the war wouldn't have dragged out this long. I mean, that's just basic, obvious, so that was propaganda, but some was completely exposed as total propaganda. And that's just typical. Let's be aware of the fact that the first casualty of war is truth, and beware the victor's version. My history teacher, my first history teacher in high school in Rhodesia, Mr. Rhys Davies, who was also a member of Parliament, used to remind us, beware the victor's version. Wartime propaganda morphs to peacetime textbooks. I remember him saying at one point, the British government are lying about us in Rhodesia now. So why would you believe anything they've got to say about the First or Second World War, the Anglo-Boer War, anything else for that matter? And, good point, true. As early as 1930, John Dewey observed, we are being exposed to the greatest flood of mass suggestion that any people has yet experienced. Well, if that was true for the 1930s, think how much worse it is now in the 2020s. Propaganda is to democracies what violence is to dictatorship. Propaganda, the calculated manipulation of public opinion to serve political and ideological interests, is pervasive. And we're also exposed to commercial propaganda, mass marketing and advertising. And propaganda today has moved into prop agenda, not only controlling what we think, but how we think and what we think about. Propaganda is aiming to do other people's thinking for them, even setting the agenda of what you talk about. Think how often it is that suddenly everyone is talking about COVID or vaccines or talking about Ukraine or Gaza or whatever the news is at that particular time. And so propaganda is now propaganda. And propaganda uses highly selective images, very devious and prejudicial language. There's dubious linkages. Often they confuse the issues and distort reality with disinformation, and this is a daily reality. In warfare, words are weapons. So propaganda involves word games, name calling of the target nation, labeling people, groups, and institutions in a negative manner. And there's generally glittering generalities with regard to our allies, labeling their people, groups, and institutions in a positive manner, and attributing the atrocities of your allies to one's enemies, such as most famously with the Katyn Forest Massacre, where the Soviets, the Western allies in the Second World War, massacred the entire Polish military hierarchy from the officers and NCOs, thousands of them in what we know now known as the Katyn Forest Massacre, although it occurred in other pasts as well. So as not to confuse your supporters with inconvenient facts, it's nice to attribute to your enemies the atrocities committed by your allies. And just think of the nonsense going on. They speak about President Vladimir Putin of Russia as a dictator, but Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine is called president. But Zelensky banned all other political parties. He banned all media except that media controlled by his government. So they don't have a free press. They don't have free government of multi-party democracy. And he banned and closed the largest religious denomination in Ukraine, which is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Closed the churches, locked up the ministers, even the Archbishop is locked up, the Patriarch. And, ministers, nuns, locking them up. And so there's no religious freedom. They're infringing on political freedom. They don't even have freedom of the press in Ukraine. Ukraine's one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and people are talking about them as being a modern George Washington, being a modern Winston Churchill, being leader of the free world, hero and president and so on. But that's just not true. So there's glittering generalities with regard to your allies. And then there's euphemisms used to pacify the audience with bland generalizations and connotations like pacification. Sounds so much better than extermination. Technical incursion, which sounds better than invasion. Civilian casualties are referred to as collateral damage. And murders replaced with liquidation. Sometimes they speak about reducing the enemy when you're just killing civilians. But anyway, terror bombings of cities is called saturation bombing or strategic bombing campaigns. Starvation of civilian population is called an economic blockade or sanctions. Looting of farms and murder of farmers is called dekulakization or land reform. And then racial discrimination is called black economic empowerment or affirmative action. And sexual perversion can be called an alternative lifestyle. So there's a bunch of euphemisms, and it's just propaganda. Call a spade a spade. False connotations are then used to transfer symbols and imagery of a positive institution to strengthen acceptance of the cause. Then they like to make use of testimonies from individuals not qualified to make these claims. For example, having sportsmen advise on how you should vote in a referendum, which we've had here in this country before. Like, what's a sportsman got to say about things that affect our business, our health, our safety, and our children? And some of these sportsmen don't even have children of their own, but now you're getting testimonies from them. And what difference does it make? And what's their qualifications to speak on behalf of this country or that issue? And then there's the ordinary appeals. Special appeals include everybody's doing it, join the bandwagon argument. And these words are designed to heighten or exploit people's fears or appeal to ordinary citizens by leaders doing ordinary things that viewers can identify with, like, look at this, Vladimir Zelensky. He walks on the road. He has a meal. He's got a wife. He also does this or that. What's that got to do with anything? So what? You get dictators who might have the same kind of hobby that we have, and he plays golf nicely. That's got nothing to do with the issues. So in 1921, the American journalist Walter Lippmann said, the art of democracy requires manufacturing consent. Manufacturing consent, which is another word for thought control. George Orwell called it thought control. So as democracies cannot control people by force, democracies control people by influencing what they think through propaganda, how they think, what they think about. Propaganda is to a democracy what violence is to a dictatorship. And propaganda tends to work because people wish to believe the best about themselves and about their country. And it's often hard to believe that our own leaders could possibly lie to us. I mean, I've got people, thinking, but our government couldn't lie to us. Well, now we've known, because Doge has reported so much of the corruption in the American government, that the US government was using USAID, for example, for generations, decades, to foment revolution. So these spontaneous Arab Spring things, completely funded by USAID, the so-called Mayan Revolution in Ukraine, completely funded by USAID and the CIA. And there's not much difference between the CIA and the USAID, as was exposed by the Doge investigations. You've got so much that governments have done where they claim they had a mandate from the population, but actually they financed it themselves, and the states organized the articles that came out, the propaganda, even the polls that were rigged. So yes, the gullibility of the public and thought control is a major part of propaganda today.
How can we best respond to the propaganda that we're experiencing now?
Well, when we only receive one side of a story, then we must know we're being lied to. There's always two sides to any story. Every action has a cause, and there's a context behind every crisis. By deplatforming alternative viewpoints, the media moguls are ensuring that we only receive one side of their story or their narrative. Truth does not fear investigation. If you're not allowed to look at the other side, then you're getting propaganda. I remember at the beginning of this war in Ukraine, there was a talk show event taking place in Australia, and somebody sent me this clip, and there was one young Australian man who, when they were talking about it, he said, well, actually, let's remember that the war didn't just start this year in 2022, it started in 2014 with the Ukrainian army attacking Russians in the Donbass region, rocketing homes and so on. And so he said, remember, 8,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed by the Ukrainian army before the Russian special investigation. Now, that's all true, and that's facts. The chairman of this discussion board ordered him out of the room, out of the studio. Instantly, just, shut up and get out. How dare you? And he just brought up facts. 8,000 Russian civilians had been killed by the Ukrainian army before the so-called war began. So the war really began in 2014, not in 2022. The war began not with Russia invading Ukraine. The war began with Ukraine invading Russian territories which had seceded from Ukraine, the Donbass region of Luhansk and Donetsk. And that's true. And it was even at the time that we were being bombarded with propaganda of here's Russia bombing Ukrainian blocks of flats. And it was a French journalist being questioned about this with a bombed out building behind her. And she said, well, where I am, all the attacks are coming from the Ukrainians, and the civilians are all Russian civilians. And they said, are you saying the Ukrainian army is bombing blocks of flats? She said, yes. Where I am reporting from in Donbass region, that's the reality. And that just didn't fit the narrative. I mean, generally speaking, actually, bad Russians, good Ukrainians, heroic Ukrainians, wonderful Vladimir Zelensky, evil President or dictator Putin, and so on. And that's the narrative. If you're only getting one side of the story, you know you're getting propaganda. And George Orwell wrote, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And Karl Marx said, the first battlefield is the rewriting of history.
What is the aim of propaganda?
Well, the aim of propaganda is defined in What Is to Be Done, written by Vladimir Lenin in 1902. Propaganda is the use of historical and scientific arguments to indoctrinate the educated and the intelligent masses. And agitation is described by Vladimir Lenin as the use of slogans, stories, and selected half-truths to exploit the grievances of the uneducated and the ignorant masses. And I'm quoting. And he spoke, there's the educated and the intelligent, and you need to give them historical and scientific arguments to indoctrinate them. But for the uneducated, ignorant masses, you give them slogans and selected half-truths and stories to exploit their grievances. So that's why it's called agit-prop, agitation propaganda. You give propaganda to educated, you give agitation to the uneducated masses. And, you can actually see this work in history as well, where they will whip people up to land and bread and food, and we're going to give you jobs, and they promise all kinds of good things, or they scream about, the racist oppression of the bourgeois or the colonials or the leaders or whatever, and they work up the agitation and the grievances of the masses on the ground, like the French Revolution, and they get agitation, but the intellectuals, they get indoctrination. And so agitation is described by them to prepare a nation for war. And the British journalist Philip Knightley identified 4 stages in preparing a nation for war. Firstly, there's the crisis. Negotiations are failing. We're at the brink of war. War is inevitable. So you whip up the crisis, screaming headlines and all that. And then there's a demonization of the enemy leader. He's absolutely evil, and you caricature the enemy leader in just a one-dimensional post. There's no reason, there's no background, there's no justification. Everything is just the leader's evil. Whether it's Saddam Hussein or whether it's, of course, the classic of all time is Adolf Hitler. He's a monster who wants to take the whole world into war and so on and so forth. And then you demonize the enemy as individuals, like all Japs are evil. I mean, they did this sort of thing, and you can't trust a Jap. And they carried on demonizing him to such a point that every Japanese American got rounded up and put into concentration camps during the Second World War, or demonizing the German people as a whole, and so on. And so wherever you need to demonize the people, like the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Nyenzis, the cockroaches, and so you demonize the enemy. And then fourthly, you need atrocities. Even if you've got to make up the stories to whip up and strengthen the emotional reactions. When America wanted to invade Iraq, they had an actress. She was actually the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to America, but she dressed up as a nurse, and she came with a sob story on CNN that the Iraqi troops walked into their maternity ward and took the kids, dumped the kids on the floor. Babies are lying on the floor dying. And I mean, she's weeping on air talking about this. And it's total fiction. Never happened. Been proven. It was a complete fraud. This is just an acting thing. And she got her debut for getting an Oscar award on CNN. Speaking about a fictitious thing, it didn't happen, but it created an emotional response where people thought, these Iraqis are evil, they need to be destroyed. Bomb Iraq, invade Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and all the rest of it. So the atrocity stories, even, whether it's something your allies did and you attribute it to your enemy, or if it's something that you did even and it's friendly fire and you attribute it to the enemy, or you just make it up, it doesn't matter. But that's how you prepare a nation for war. Crisis, demonize the enemy leader, demonize the enemy individuals, and make up atrocities. And so every unit of the Communist Party was to have an agit-prop section. Deceit in propaganda is justified, the communists say, because the end justifies the means. You can't make an egg you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. And as Vladimir Lenin regularly said, treaties are like pie crusts. They're made to be broken. To tell the truth is a petty bourgeois habit, but to lie, and to lie convincingly, is a sign of superior intelligence. So that's what the communists believe. Lying is an art form to be perfected. The aim of propaganda is to rally people behind a cause. And if this requires exaggerating, misrepresenting, or even lying to gain support, the end justifies the means. Lying is perfectly acceptable if you're doing it for a noble cause. So speak about the noble lie. And propaganda doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be plausible, possible. Sometimes it can tell the truth, but withhold the point of view from the other side to create a distorted one-side perspective. Just think how kids do this. He hit me. Yeah, but you hit me first. And he hit me. Yeah, but what happened beforehand? Well, the fact that you started the fight isn't the point. If you could just whine enough and complain, use the zoom lens and forget about the wide-angle lens of context. Ignore the context. It doesn't matter what was provoked and what was done. You just need to make out your chosen victim, that he was attacked. Why he was attacked, how he provoked the attack is irrelevant for this purpose. We leave that out. So Knightley observed, the media demands that we trust it, but all too often that trust has been betrayed. And that is so true. They distort perspectives because the end justifies the means.
Can we identify some of the tactics of propaganda?
We certainly can, yes. So common tactics that you can recognize in propaganda are ignoring the historic context. I mean, once upon a time, some evil Afrikaners just woke up and said, I know what, let's create apartheid just to frustrate the lives of black people in South Africa. Ignore the context of the Mifakan, the Diffakan, Dingon, ignoring signed treaty, slaughtering Piet Retief, his son and his 100 followers at Ungungungluvu. We don't need to know about that fact. We don't need to know about all the cattle raids on the eastern frontier. We don't need to know about the national suicide of the Xhosa, how they destroyed all the cattle, hoping that some mystical Russians were going to come, kill all the whites and give them all the farms. And this is back in the 1850s, the national suicide, the cause, where they destroyed all their crops, destroyed all their grain stocks, destroyed all the cattle, because the witch doctor told them if they did this, the Russians would come, kill all the whites, drive them into the sea, and you can get their farms and their cattle and their herds. And so, the context of the communist revolutions taking place all over Africa, the slaughtering of whites, the massacres of missionaries in the Congo, putting whites through chainsaws in sawmills in Angola, beheading ministers and missionaries in Mozambique, all the kinds of atrocities being done, which led to the draw the lager and bring up racial segregation laws to protect us from the violence and the savagery that was taking place. Like the Sharpeville massacre comes up in the news a lot, but let's not bring up the Cato Manor massacre a few weeks before, where the same kind of rioters had slaughtered all the policemen in Cato Manor and cooked and eaten. So, you don't want to know about that. Let's just focus on the reaction, not on what came before it. So ignore the historic context. Use selective stories. There might be more stories of what your side has done atrocities of, but no, we're not going to focus on it. We're going to choose the stories where our selected enemy did something bad, or we can at least present it as bad. And then you utilize a narrow source of experts, the ones who toe the party line, who repeat the narrative. So, for example, the COVID cults, they had these people coming up with all kinds of what we now know were lies, and more lies. And they even manufactured pictures to get people into the lockdown lunacy, masquerade madness, salvation by vaccination, COVID cults in 2020. They had pictures of people just falling down on the streets of China, and people in hazmat suits coming to remove them. We never saw that for the rest of the so-called pandemic, where people are meant to be dying by the millions. You never saw people just dropping dead in the streets. You saw people dropping dead on sports fields after the vaccination was given, but they promoted a completely false narrative. All experts agree. Well, then you'd get a whole lot of frontline doctors and others saying, no, but this isn't true, and so on and so forth. Well, they get deplatformed. No, they're not real doctors, but they've got all the medical experience. It doesn't matter. They're giving, like all scientists agree. Then you get a bunch of scientists saying, no, but that's not true. And, well, you're not a real scientist. Well, look how many degrees and doctorates they've got. No, but that doesn't matter. They don't agree with the narrative we're giving, and so they're not a real scientist. All historians agree. Well, these historians don't. Well, they're not real historians. All journalists agree. Well, a whole lot of journalists don't agree. Yeah, but they're not real journalists, and so on and so forth. So you have a selective source of experts, and they must toe the party line, and they must repeat the narrative. You have to demonize the enemy, super important. Enemy is not just wrong, they're not just on the other team, they are evil. They don't even deserve to exist, don't deserve to breathe. You use a narrow focus, you need the zoom lens. When they can't use the wide angle lens of context, and they can only use the zoom lens, they're hiding something. And so, for example, if parents are away and they want to have evidence that their child's tidied up their room, it's no good for the kid to just take a zoom lens of one shelf of the bookcase. Well, I'd like to see the whole house. No, I'm just giving you the zoom lens. What's the kitchen like? What's the bathroom like? No, we're not going to give you the zoom lens. We're just giving you this one. I mean, look how neat this bookshelf is. Okay, but what's the rest of the house like? What does the living room look like? What does the laundry room look like? No, I'm not going to give you any wide angle lens. We're just giving you a zoom lens. And then you've got to know they're hiding something from me. And that's the way it is in history too. So there's a whole lot of tactics of propaganda, and Professor Johan Galtung's listed some tactics used in propaganda, including decontextualizing the violence, focus on the irrational without looking at the reasons. So, I mean, for example, if you've ever seen a Dirty Harry movie, like the Dirty Harry film, the first one, there's a scene where the San Francisco policeman has the stadium lights switched on, and there's this man running across the field, and he shoots him. He shoots him in the leg, the man falls over, he walks up and he puts his leg on the wounded foot, and he starts to torture him. And, this chap's screaming through the night, and get the camera receding out of the stadium as this chap's screaming as he's being tortured by the policeman. Now, if you just show that in its own, police brutality. But what's the context? Well, this man happens to be a kidnapper who's kidnapped a little girl, put her in a confined space where she's going to die of lack of oxygen in a matter of the next few hours. And he's trying to save the life of this kidnapped person, which in the end it turns out he fails to do because she is already dead. But he didn't know that at that time. So you decontextualize violence. I mean, is Dirty Harry, is he an evil policeman torturing some poor innocent person, or is he a concerned policeman trying to save the life of some innocent girl who's been kidnapped by this torturous, murderous thug that he's at the moment applying serious pressure to? And obviously it hurts, but decontextualize the violence. Dualism. Reduce the number of parties in a conflict to 2, even though there's normally more than 2 parties in a war. And so you've got the good and you've got the bad. I mean, simple, black and white. It's just so straight. There's no grey, there's no in between, there's no ambiguity here at all. Everyone on the one side is evil, everyone on the other side is good. Even though amongst the Allies in the Second World War you had the Soviet Union, who was the biggest bunch of mass murderers in history. Yeah, but they're allies, they're good. And then they say, we've got the democracies versus the dictatorships. Except for the fact that several of the people in the dictatorships, like Mussolini and Hitler, were actually voted into position. They were voted to be dictators. They even had referendums on that. And some of the allies, such as Finland, were total democracies. And then you look at the Allies side, well, who voted for Joseph Stalin? Who voted for Winston Churchill, for that matter? Who voted for Jan Smuts in South Africa? Jan Smuts took power in a coup d'etat in South Africa against the most popular South African Prime Minister in history, Judge General James Barry Hertzog, had won 5 elections against Jan Smuts in a row. And he was Prime Minister of South Africa in 1939. But he didn't want to declare war on Germany. He didn't think it had anything to do with South Africa or even Britain for that matter. And so Jan Smuts, who was the man who'd lost the last 5 elections, he takes power without an election, without a referendum. Effectively, it's a coup d'etat because Britain tells him, take power, South Africa must declare war and ship all its gold to the Sound naval base and load it onto the USS Quincy, a battle cruiser sent from America. And only once South Africa's gold arrives in New York Harbor does Lend-Lease begin. And Jan Smuts makes this happen without a vote in Parliament, without the people of South Africa knowing. In fact, I discovered this from an American textbook. Extraordinary that South Africans don't even know that we had a coup in 1939 that removed an elected government, a popular government, from power because they didn't want to declare war. And what happened to our gold and so on. And we actually paid for arming the Soviet Union and things like that with South African gold. You mustn't bring that up because that just confuses the issue. And then you might see also Manichaeism. One side is only good, the other side is demonized as evil. Armageddon. The violence is inevitable. You omit alternatives like you didn't have to have war to achieve some of the goals. If you look at the map of Eastern Europe today, the map of Eastern Europe today looks very much like Eastern Europe looked like at the end of the First World War with the German peace treaty with Russia, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which recognized the independence of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine. And interesting, we're back to what Versailles reversed and what the First World War enforced. So plainly, there sometimes is more than one possible solution. You don't always have to have war. You could have peace treaties deciding some things. And so ignoring the alternatives to war and demonizing the people who wanted to consider war. You just think of Remains of the Day, which is a very favorite film for many women-liking romance type of film. But the backstory is a British royal family that's trying to bring about peace between Germany and Britain. You never hear the arguments or anything they're saying because, of course, nobody wants to hear that. You just want to hear Churchill was right and Britain was on the right side and Britain was right not to negotiate but just to fight. Even though they lost the empire as a result and betrayed the whole of Eastern Europe at the end into decades of absolutely catastrophic persecution under the Soviet Union. But we don't want to consider the possible alternatives. And so they simplify and demonize these people who are trying actually a noble thing to avoid a war between Germany and Britain, and demonizing it. So you get confusion, focused only on the conflict area, don't focus on the forces or factors that influence the violence, like communism. I mean, why do you want to know anything about communism? Russia's our ally. We don't need to understand the guiding force behind the Soviet Union. They're on our side. They're the good guys. And so you never explain why there are acts of revenge and spirals of violence. So one doesn't want to go into everything that preceded in Yugoslavia or Serbia and the centuries that the Turks controlled these areas in southeastern Europe. And you don't want to look at what the Turks were doing or what Islam was doing in the jihad to understand the background to what's going on in these areas. Let's just bomb Serbia and things like that. And 7, failure to explore the causes of the escalation and the impact of the media coverage itself. Sometimes wars have been caused by the media, and the media lies. And you just think of, can anyone remember back in 2002, 2003, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. They've got everything from nuclear bombs to massive amounts of gas and biological warfare materials, and that's why America's got to invade Iraq. It's not because of the oil, it's all because of weapons of mass destruction. Well, they really tried hard, but they could never find those blasted weapons of mass destruction, which was the reason for the war. And Britain and America swore to the world before the UN, straight to the camera lenses, their weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and to safeguard the whole world from these stockpiles of vast amounts of biological warfare materials and gas and nuclear weapons. They're going to kill us all. We've got to invade. And then they invade, they kill about 1 million people, destroy a great country, not to mention what was done to the poor zoo and the poor animals in Baghdad, and all the people. But at the end you find out, oh, sorry, we lied. That wasn't the real reason. But anyway, this happens so often. They have all kinds of lies, and more lies, never explaining why the acts of revenge and why the mass media itself can cause a war. And then 8, failure to explore the goals of outside interventionists, especially big powers and bankers. Like sometimes we find out, like Stephen Mitchell Goodson warned us in History of Central Banking and Enslavement of Mankind, that actually the main wars of the 20th century were on places where their governments didn't have a Rothschild bank based on usury. Like Japan, Italy, Germany, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran. Isn't it interesting? Could that have anything to do with it? What an amazing coincidence that so many of the countries the West goes after turns out not to have a Rothschild-controlled bank that's based on usury. And so maybe there's some other reasons. Sometimes there's oil. Could that have anything to do with it? Maybe it's not the weapons of mass destruction. Maybe it's a huge oil reserves. So failure to explore the goals of possible outside interventionists. Number 9, failure to explore the peace proposals and offer images of peaceful outcomes. And so the war is inevitable. We have to, but maybe we could have achieved good and better without war through a more peaceful means. And people don't want to consider that. And they demonize people who consider the fact that maybe if we could reverse the evil doings of the Versailles Treaty and give back to Germany territory that had been stolen from them in the Versailles Treaty, like the Danzig Corridor and Sudetenland and so on. But you're not allowed to look at that now because you've just got to accept that war was a good war, and it's a stamp of the Pope almost over it. You cannot question his religion. And yes, you could have avoided the war peacefully, and millions of people who died could have been alive as a result. And who knows how much good could have come to the world if we could have avoided ruinous wars like the Second World War, for example, through peace and through negotiated settlements. Then you have confusing ceasefires and negotiations with actual peace. A ceasefire is not the same thing as peace, and negotiations isn't the same thing as peace. They're steps that may lead to it, but so often they ignore the fact that negotiations can actually be part of the war. And then omitting reconciliation is a viable option. There's also Mirin Guterres of Interpress Service summarized propaganda strategies as incompleteness, inaccuracy, driving the agenda, milking the story, exploiting what we want to believe best about ourselves, perception management, reinforcing existing attitudes, simple repetitions and emotional phrases. So Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister during the Second World War, declared, "In wartime, truth is so precious. Truth must be attended to by a bodyguard of lies." And that sounds very duplicitous thinking. How can truth be protected by a bodyguard of lies? And the other position of the enemy is routinely caricatured and stereotyped, so that when you just see the other side being depicted as caricatures and stereotypes, you must know you're being targeted by propaganda. And this is well put by Mark Twain. In 1916, he said, as propaganda rose in America, "Next, the statesman will invent cheap lies, putting the blame upon the nation that will be attacked, and every man will be glad of these conscience-soothing falsities, and will diligently study them, and refuse to examine any refutation of them. And thus he will by and by convince himself the war is just, and he will thank God for the better sleep he enjoys after this process of grotesque self-deception."
And when most people think about propaganda these days, they think of Joseph Goebbels' Nazi propaganda department, not the American Committee for Public Information.
Well, yes, many people know that Joseph Goebbels used propaganda to advance the aims of the National Socialist government of Adolf Hitler. What few people realize is the National Socialist propaganda was based upon and modeled upon Allied propaganda against Germany in World War I. Joseph Goebbels was an ardent student of the American public relations pioneer Edward Bernays. And in fact, Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf analyzed Allied propaganda techniques used during the First World War. Quoting from Adolf Hitler, "The art of propaganda led in understanding the emotional ideas of the masses and finding, through a psychologically correct form, the way to get the attention and then to the heart of the masses. The purpose of propaganda is to convince the masses. Its effect, for the most part, must be aimed at the emotions. The war propaganda of the English and of the Americans was psychologically sound. By presenting the Germans to their own people as barbarians and Huns, they prepared the individual for the terrors of war. All of this was effective, and effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must continually harp on these and slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by these slogans. To be a leader means that you need to be able to move the masses. The intelligence of the masses is very small. Their forgetfulness is great. They must be told the same thing 1,000 times." And during the Nuremberg trials, Field Marshal Hermann Göring reported, "It is always a simple matter to drag people along, whether it be a democracy or a dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of its leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing their country to danger. It works the same in any country." So, yes, that's what Edward Bernays inspired all of these propagandists with his strategies.
And who exactly was Edward Bernays?
So Bernays based his methodology on the social science research of the French psychologist Gustave Le Bon in his book, The Psychology of the Crowd, and on Sigmund Freud's 1922 book, The Analysis of the Ego and Group Psychology, as well as the research of Russian experimental psychologist Ivan Pavlov, published in his book Conditioned Reflexes. So Edward Bernays, who lived from 1891 to 1995, was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Bernays was a theatrical publicist who was employed by George Creel as a propagandist for the Committee on Public Information, the CPI, which President Woodrow Wilson established by executive order. And the Committee on Public Information was to work in association with military intelligence to turn the American people who are overwhelmingly against intervention in Europe's war into being supportive of the war in Europe. And so the CPI was America's propaganda department. The CPI defined propaganda as the systematic, widespread dissemination or promotion of particular ideas, doctrines, or practice meant to further a particular cause or agenda or weaken that of another. It is a systematic effort to manipulate attitudes, beliefs, and actions by the use of symbols. That's Edward Bernays described propaganda in the CPI manual.
Were there other pioneers of propaganda other than Edward Bernays?
Yes, so the German philosopher George Hegel in 1821, he wrote the book The Philosophy of Right. He explained in democracies the public must be manipulated and persuaded by hidden persuaders and hidden manipulators. And the French author Anatole France wrote, democracy is run by an unseen engineer. And so Bernays based much of his methodology upon the works also of Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann wrote about controlling and managing public opinions, and his ideas were later published in Public Opinion, 1922, and The Phantom Public of 1925. And Walter Lippmann was a member of the U.S. military intelligence during the First World War. Lippmann believed most people are irrational and act chaotically, and because people are unable to independently make rational choices, people need to be guided by a specialized class of enlightened elites. And Lippmann described people as simple-minded, sheep-like, incapable of formulating or organizing their desires, interests, or wishes. Therefore, the enlightened elites can lead and educate the masses or manipulate them. And Lippmann put it, making of one general will out of the multitude of general wishes. And Bernays stated the public must be regimented. And you can see how this is done by propaganda and by public relations. So in 1927, Harold Lessman, a professor in social science at the University of Chicago, analyzed the propaganda techniques used by the Allies in the First World War. A new and subtler instrument must wield thousands, even millions of human beings into one amalgamated mass of hate and war and hope through propaganda. It is the new dynamic of society. The fact remains propaganda is one of the most powerful instrumentalities in the modern world. Propaganda is a reflex to the irrationality, the immensity, the woefulness of the modern world. And Lassalle explained that to mobilize the hatred of a people against any enemy, you need to represent the whole nation as a menacing, murderous aggressor. Represent the opposing nation as satanic, how it violates all moral standards. That's how you mobilize hate and war.
Can you identify some of the objectives of propaganda?
Yes, so Laswell identified four major objectives of propaganda. Number one, to mobilize hatred against the enemy. The enemy must be dehumanized, portrayed as barbaric, brutal, cruel, and uncivilized. Number two, your objective is to preserve the friendship of your allies. Number three, to preserve the friendship and, if possible, to procure the cooperation of neutrals. And number four, to demoralize the enemy. So, for example, in the South African Army, we spoke about PsyOps or ComOps, own forces to build up own morale of our people, and ComOps or psychological operations, enemy forces. We seek to break down the enemy's morale. So continually, there's a positive side to propaganda, build up your own people's morale, and negative side, break down your enemy's morale, which could be by false stories, all sorts of ways that you can undermine the enemy.
Were there any people who foresaw the dangers and warned against the potential pitfalls of propaganda?
Well, funnily enough, Woodrow Wilson, before the presidential elections of 1916, warned, as he was meant to be the candidate for peace, he warned, lead this people into war and they will forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fibre of national life, infecting the Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street. So in January 1916, Woodrow Wilson warned, this is a government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war. So isn't it interesting? He campaigned as a candidate for peace. And then after being elected under the slogan of he has kept us out of war, Woodrow Wilson established the Committee for Public Information, which forged the nation, which was overwhelmingly opposed to intervention into a situation where if anyone believed that America's entry into war was a mistake, they were branded as a traitor and might be lynched. In fact, it was so serious, over 80% of Americans were calculated to be against getting involved in the war in Europe. But the Committee on Public Information turned it into 85% for war and only 15% against war. So that just shows how democracy is meaningless if you can manipulate it to an opposite position just by a propaganda department.
So this was an extremely successful propaganda enterprise.
Yes, it did succeed in altering people's perceptions. So more than 8 million Americans were of German origin. So there were over 8 million German Americans living in America at the time. Many were sympathetic to the cause of their homeland, obviously. And 1/3 of Americans were immigrants. But interestingly, Britain's first act in the First World War, before any shot was fired, was to send out their ships and drag up the underwater cables linking Germany with New York to rip up any direct communication Germany could have with America. So the British were so astute on this, they recognized this is the most important thing we can do in the war. Break the communication between Germany and America. And then after that, America could only learn what was coming from the British cables. And 1/3 of Americans were immigrants. Most Americans were not connected to Europe by blood or capital and were not interested in waging wars overseas. In fact, George Washington, America's first president, had said, beware of entangling alliances and never get involved in Europe's wars. And that was the Washington doctrine, which soon got abandoned by future American presidents, especially Woodrow Wilson. And so the Committee on Public Information developed the most formidable propaganda apparatus in history. And they chose George Creel, a muckraking journalist, to lead the CPI. And with a phenomenal budget in the millions, the CPI recruited from the best in business, the best in the media, the best in academia, the best in the art world. And the CPI, with no funding restrictions, blended advanced advertising techniques with a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. And it was the first time that a modern government disseminated propaganda on such a large scale. And although we think of propaganda today as being linked to the totalitarian governments, like Red China and the Soviet Union, it's a fact of history. Propaganda first emerged in a democratic state. And although as a journalist George Creel had been an outspoken critic of censorship, once the CPI got its funding and powers, they took immediate steps to limit conflicting information. And the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act voluntary guidelines were enforced on news media and assured that the mass media in the United States was flooded only with pro-war material and pro-war perspectives. On any given week, more than 20,000 newspaper columns were filled with media gleaned from the CPI press releases. So they dominated the landscape, and the opposition didn't even get a chance. So the CPI created a division of syndicated features, recruited the help of leading novelists, short story writers, essayists, to present a pro-war position in popular, digestible format. And so they reached 12 million readers a month. And just by giving money to some of the best in the business, and, we want this perspective written, very few authors or journalists were willing to turn such an offer down. And the division of pictorial publicity had at its disposal the most talented advertising illustrators, the best cartoonists of the time, and so powerful posters painted in patriotic colors presented compelling images throughout the country, and the poster division motivated millions to enlist in the army or navy or to buy Liberty bonds, and the division of films ensured that the war was promoted in the cinema. Hollywood has always been eager to support whatever war the government in Washington is promoting at that time. And the Hollywood film industry wholeheartedly support the war effort, and they came up with movie titles like The Kaiser, The Beast of Berlin, The Wolves of Culture, and To Hell with the Kaiser, and Pershing's Crusaders. Now, Pershing was the head of the U.S. military expeditionary force to Europe. Pershing's Crusaders. And the cause of the Allies was creatively publicized in every available communication channel, including pulpits. There was a surprising amount of pastors willing to preach sermons that would mobilize people to join the war effort or to fund the war bonds and so on. And Laswell pointed out, propaganda wins wars. It wins wars with words and pictures and songs and parades and other similar devices by the manipulation of collective attitudes. And you think later, America lost the war in Vietnam, as General Giap of the Vietnamese said, the Americans didn't lose the war in Vietnam on the battlefields of Vietnam. They actually won on the battlefields of Vietnam. They lost on the TV screens and on the college campuses back in America and the front pages of newspapers. And that's true. The Vietnamese realized we can't beat them on the battlefield. We're going to beat them through propaganda in America. And the American journalists supported the Vietnamese well enough because of their sympathy for communism. So it's quite true. Propaganda wins wars. In the case of Vietnam, propaganda lost the Americans the war. So the CPI propaganda showed the way for future propaganda agencies by appealing to the heart, not the mind. Emotional agitation, skillful manipulation, makes use of manufactured stories, atrocity stories, especially in simplistic slogans, like "Make the world safe for democracy." And Will Irwin, a member of CPI, wrote after the war, "We never told the whole truth, not by any means." And G.S. Verrick quoted a military intelligence officer declaring, "You can't tell them the truth." So victories were routinely manufactured by American military authorities, while defeats were suppressed. Dishonesty was encouraged, and you're seeing it going on right now with the Ukraine war. They will manufacture victories. They will ignore defeats from their side. And the analyst attributed the failure of the German propaganda effort in America to this fact, because the German propaganda emphasized logic over passion. And Count von Bernstorff in Germany observed, "The outstanding characteristic of the average American is a great, though superficial, sentimentality. And the factual German press releases failed to grasp this. They focused on facts and reason. But you don't motivate people by reason and facts, you motivate them mainly by emotion." And so it's an emotional picture. It may not be true, it may be totally fabricated or fictional, but it's the heart that moves people to action, not the mind so much. So Laswell said, "So great is the psychological resistance to war in a modern nation that every war must appear as a war of defense against a menacing, murderous aggressor. There must be no ambiguity about who the public is to hate." So Bernays openly admitted he and his colleagues made up stories to provoke the hate and fear necessary to raise war bands and recruits for the war. And some of their stories, like baths full of eyeballs and children being killed by the enemy, were actually recycled fiction from previous conflicts. And so effective was the anti-German propaganda in the CPI in America, Dachshunds had to be renamed. German shepherds also had to be renamed as Alsatians. There were cases where Dachshunds and German shepherds got stoned to death, just animals for having the wrong name. 14 states banned the teaching or speaking of German in their public schools, even though millions of Americans spoke German as a second language. Mobs assaulted German immigrants, and they even lynched some poor Amish in Pennsylvania because he didn't want to join up with the army, because they're pacifists. And Robert Prager, a German coal miner, was also lynched by an angry mob in Illinois, just for having a German name. And the CPI recognized, while emotional appeals and simplistic stereotypes of the enemy could influence many, the intellectuals and the pacifists are going to need a different motivation. So to them, the American military intervention in Europe was described as a campaign to end warfare forever, the war to end all wars, and to establish a League of Nations. To the industrialists, the war was modified as a conflict to destroy the competition of German industry. And the propagandists didn't have to ask if it's true, merely does it work.
Was the propaganda confined to times of war, or did the propaganda end at the conclusion of the war?
No, in the final months of 1920, a war-weary American public ousted the Democrats who had led them into World War II. The Republican majority won the Congress, the Senate, and the White House, and they brought in laws to prevent America ever again getting involved in a foreign war. Well, that was the intention. Of course, FDR reversed all that. But the director of the CPI's foreign division reported the history of propaganda in the war would scarcely be worth consideration here, but for one fact, it didn't stop with the armistice. No, indeed. The methods invented and tried out in the war were too valuable for the uses of governments, factions, and special interests. So Edward Bernays took the techniques he had learned in CPI to Madison Avenue, and he started what he called PR. PR, the first letters of propaganda, but he changed it to public relations. So PR is propaganda for business. And so it was, of course, the astonishing success of our propaganda during the war that opened the eyes of the intelligent few in all departments of life to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind. And so Edward Bernays wrote the book Propaganda in 1928, and he used the words PR as a whole new commercial division, public relations. Most Americans came to realize they'd been lied to and manipulated by deceit disguised as news. And many sought to pin complete responsibility for America's involvement in a ruinous world war on the hate-mongering militarists in the CPI. However, as one noticed, ultimately the guilt is less important than it questions the activities raised about the role of propaganda in a democratic society. The whole theory of democratic society is rooted in the belief that free citizens can form their own opinions about the issues of the day to decide their collective destiny. So freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, freedom of association, freedom of thought, freedom of religion are all fundamental necessities for any democratic process.
Isn't there the danger that propaganda will subvert society and undermine real freedom?
Yes, is propaganda compatible with freedom? Not really. During the First World War, America's political leaders decided their citizens were not making the correct decisions fast enough. So they flooded the channels of communication with dishonest messages that were designed to stir up emotions and to provoke hatred of their long-time trading partner, Germany. And the war did come to an end, but the propaganda did not come to an end, especially not from Hollywood. And today, many who espouse the ideals of democracy behave like dictators and propagandists. And the question is whether propaganda can be compatible with freedom. In the government you elect, you don't elect them in order to lie to you, to provoke you to want to support a future war. And propaganda clearly undermines a population's ability to think clearly and to think critically about world events. Simplistic emotional appeals undermine logic and reason.
So the First World War saw the first propaganda and disinformation departments, but weren't there perhaps previous examples of propaganda being used during times of war?
Yes, so students of propaganda have noticed that while the CPR was the largest propaganda operation to that date, it wasn't actually the first time such deceptive operations led to war. So shortly after the end of the American Civil War, or the war between the states, the journalist Colburn Adams wrote, "The future historian of this late war will have a very difficult task to perform, to sift the truth from the falsehood as it appears in official records. Because beware the victor's version. They will destroy all the facts of what was noble on the side of the enemy that's now defeated, and they will promote their own version of everything." Well, two prominent newspapermen took credit for leading America into the Spanish-American War of 1898. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. You've heard the Pulitzer Prize, and almost everyone's heard of Hearst. Two of the greatest names in journalism in America. They clamored through their editorials for American military intervention against Spain, which then was a great superpower. And through disinformation, through media manipulations, these newspaper tycoons induced the United States to wage an unnecessary aggressive war against Spain. There were sensational, inflammatory, propagandistic articles and editorials in Pulitzer's World and Hearst's Journal, which succeeded in inciting war hysteria and public enthusiasm for a war against Spain. And Randolph Hearst famously sent the artist Frederick Remington and other journal correspondents to report on the civil war in Cuba. When Remington reported, "Everything is quiet here, there's no trouble, there will be no war, I wish to return," Hearst sent the famous telegraph in reply, "Please remain, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." And Pulitzer and Hearst published inaccurate coverage, rumor, subterfuge, hearsay, outright fictitious reports to drum up a feverish public demand for war. And so on the 15th of February, 1898, the U.S. battleship Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. And this became a refrain, "Remember the Maine." And the evidence is that this was an own goal, it was a false flag. The cause of the explosion was never determined, but the immediate U.S. media reaction was to blame Spain. Spain had blown up an American battleship, although the evidence is that the bomb came from within their own ammunition hold. But still, Pulitzer and Hearst clamored for war with titles like "Marine Explosion, Caused by Bomb or Torpedo." I mean, that's, talk about leading. What a headline. And Hearst's journal ran the headline, "How do you like our journal's war?" And plainly, later they were proud of the fact that we started the war against Spain. And that's a war that started with a false flag, and it turned out to be everything about the American-Spanish War was a lie.
But even during peacetime, we are confronted with commercial propaganda, as you mentioned, in the form of PR.
Yes, so after World War I, Edward Bernays pioneered PR, or public relations, and he became known as the father of spin. And as the PR consultant for the American Tobacco Company, he campaigned to convince American women they should smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes, the torches of freedom, to emancipate themselves. And so he went to the tobacco company and said, I can double your customers. And they said, how's that possible? He said, I can get women to smoke. They said, you'll never convince women to smoke. And he said, give me the budget, I'll do it. And he hired women models to smoke at Easter parades, and he hired the photographers to get pictures of these well-posed, of these women in public smoking. And these were some of the most glamorous women in America. And this came on the front page of newspapers. And then they, along with that, had advert campaigns of women smoking, lighting up torches of freedom to emancipate themselves, linking this to the Lady Liberty holding the torch of freedom. And so, apparently getting lung cancer and coughing and choking and eroding your health is a way of emancipating yourself. Yeah, women can get lung cancer too or whatever. So he became the father of spin. He also convinced people that all needed fans and air conditioners. And so he chose a whole lot of interesting things, and through advertising managed to get people convinced. He even got doctors paid to pose wearing their stethoscope and their white coats, smoking cigarettes, saying, more doctors recommend Lucky Strike cigarettes than the other. You need this protection for your throat. And even had radio interviewers being paid to be by the radio microphone with their cigarette in their hand, that, all people on radio know that smoking is good for your lungs, and public speakers must all smoke, and so on. So this Edward Bernays was absolutely unscrupulous and effective. And today, American businesses spend trillions of dollars on marketing. Public relations firms in America alone employ over 150,000 workers. So PR, or propaganda in commerce, is a massive industry worldwide.
Yeah, Dr. Hammond, thank you for helping us to understand and give us insights into the history of propaganda. What about today? Are we still being subjected to this barrage of propaganda?
Yes, I think just seeing how our own government could sponsor this, not now named so-called Afrikaners prominent writers through fake news 24/7 shows it's still happening. But take, for example, John Rendon, the founder of the Rendon Group, a public relations academy. He told cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado, I'm a politician. I use communication to meet public policy. I'm an information warrior and a perception manager. Did you ever stop to wonder how the people of Kuwait City, after being held hostage by Iraq for 7 long months, were able to get handheld American flags? Well, now you know the answer. That was one of my jobs. And you often wonder, where did those posters come from? Where did those flags come from? Well, they are carefully crafted media campaign people. So another propaganda tactic is character assassination. So smear tactics are used to discredit or destroy the reputation of anyone who is perceived as an obstacle to policymakers. It's amazing how when a person starts to rock the boat and to cause problems for some people, suddenly all kinds of scandals come out. I mean, 6 scandals are very convenient to either exaggerate or to invent. And of course, accusing them of being anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and now transphobic bigots really helps. And being a Holocaust denier, I mean, they did that on Stephen Mitford Goodson and others because he is undermining their secrecy when it came to the economic warfare. So the calculated manipulation of public opinion to serve political and ideological interests is achieved by appealing to emotions to create reality which demands the action desired by the policymakers. And that sometimes involves just propaganda, character assassination to destroy the credibility of the people who might be rocking the boat. So in my book, Holocaust in Rwanda, I documented the ease with which the orchestrators of the genocide in Rwanda confused the international journalists, abused the national media to mobilize unprecedented concentration of carnage. The massacres had been meticulously planned in advance, and yet they were able to portray the killings as spontaneous tribal anarchy, uncontrolled tribal killing, tribalism, the result of the war, which is a complete fraud. And I document in my book how they had a smokescreen of disinformation behind which the killers could proceed with their diabolical plans. And they killed over 800,000 people in a mere 6 weeks, mostly with machetes. And it was the publication media that was able to make the conditions in which they could get away with it. They cut communications, they restricted travel, they isolated the victims, they stifled the flow of news, They timed the genocide to be launched on the 6th of April 1994, when most African correspondents were in South Africa for the so-called Mandela elections, and with most foreign affairs and foreign newspapers distracted by the events in South Africa, the mass murderers in Rwanda were able to play their humanitarian card and plead for emergency aid, all while engaging in murder and genocide. So they mobilized mass murder to a large extent using their radio RTLM, accusing the Tutsi of sinister plots, and they had popular poets and songwriters composing songs to provoke the majority Hutu tribe to hate their Tutsi neighbors. So there's all kinds of ways how you can see that the Rwandan Holocaust was driven by propaganda. And many of the massacres of prisoners and the atrocities committed against civilians in the First and Second World War, including the saturation bombings of cities, none of it could have been possible without demonizing the targeted enemy and dehumanizing the civilian populations by propaganda. And the farm invasions in Zimbabwe were preceded by state propaganda which vilified the whites in general and the farmers in particular. And the Mau Mau murders in Kenya and the Simba massacres in the Congo, these were motivated and mobilized by propaganda, dehumanized the targeted white farmers and missionaries, and whip up the anti-white incessant propaganda, which leads to the brutal murders of the farmers in South Africa in the most torturous ways. Songs like Kill the Boer, Kill the Farmer, sung by prominent ANC and EFF leaders, it's like pouring petrol on the fire. The fact is, propaganda changes perceptions, propaganda changes people, propaganda kills. And that's why it's absolutely essential to know the truths of history, to recognize the lies of propaganda. We need to study the truth in the Bible so that we can be freed from the deceptions of the world.
Thank you, Dr. Hammond. In closing, I'd like to read from John chapter 8, verse 32. Then Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Thank you very much for joining us for From the Frontline. God bless and good night.